Thank you, Peter, and indeed I think it was a long beery night in Singapore. The question is, which one of those long beery nights in Singapore was it? Thanks, and thanks for the great introduction. To set the scene for this session, first of all, I want to share with you my insights on what I think by this term supply chain ecosystems. And I want to do that in two ways. First of all, look at how supply chain has evolved into what it is today, which in my terminology is a complex global ecosystem. And then secondly, look at the key role that logistics plays in indeed empowering those supply chain ecosystems. So first of all, the supply chains have become global. Nothing new there. What you may be aware of is that around the world there are more than 300 active preferential trade agreements, bilateral or multilateral. There are also another 100 preferential trade agreements under negotiation. There are some huge ones like the TPP, which will consume a very large part of the Trans-Pacific, and there's the European one, there's the China-Asia one, there's the ASEAN grouping. So all this is further enabling the globalization of our supply chains. This involves offshoring, low-cost country sourcing, outsourcing, exporting, importing, obviously. And what we have is multiple international organizations being involved in these supply chains. And the more borders we cross with a supply chain, typically the more complications we introduce and the challenges of cross borders become magnified. So they're global. Secondly, they're much more complex. We have numerous different organizations involved across the supply chains. I'll give some examples in just a minute. One of the things that we find in this complex world is that between two entities, so let's say I'm dealing with company ABC, company ABC in some scenarios could be my customer. In a different scenario, company ABC could be my supplier. And in another different scenario, company ABC could be my competitor. So we have a positional role play within the complexity of the supply chain ecosystem. Thirdly, and thankfully, supply chain has become strategic, largely because of the globalization and the complexity. We're increasingly seeing chief supply chain officers' positions in the boardroom, on the strategic agenda, at the decision-making driving engine of the business, which has to be a good thing. As Peter said, generally speaking, it's the unsung heroes of supply chain and logistics that only really get noticed when something goes wrong. And when it does go wrong, all hell breaks loose. So increasingly, it's seen as a strategic driver of the business and with the appropriate seniority of the leadership of the supply chain and logistics organizations. It's also increasingly seen as a source of competitive advantage, certainly in certain sectors where time to market is critical. If we think of the global simultaneous worldwide releases of consumer electronic products, if we think about the need to have fresh produce out of season in stores around the world, then it becomes a competitive advantage. They're built on these four pillars of visibility, speed, of course, flexibility, and collaboration. Collaboration for me is an overused word. I think we use it too much. And what I found interesting a few years ago, I'm not sure what prompted me to do this, but I looked up the English dictionary to find out the meaning of collaboration. And my word of warning about collaboration results from that dictionary definition. There are indeed two definitions of collaboration. The first one is the one we expect and the one generally we mean when we use the word collaboration, which is to work with others for mutual benefit. The second definition of collaboration in the English dictionary is to willingly assist the enemy. And therefore I urge, partly because of that, partly because it's very difficult to execute, particularly on an organizational level, caution about how we proceed with collaboration. But amongst this complexity, we have to collaborate. Just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. If we think through our day, right, we got up, we had breakfast. Some of us would have travelled to Liverpool, or I certainly travelled to Liverpool by aeroplane, maybe not so many other people. The international guests would have got a plane here. We would be checking our smartphones during the day, and then maybe when we go back tonight, we might watch a DVD. So let's think about those processes during the day. A friend from New Zealand was very proud that of his global supply chain, he shipped 160,000 20-foot containers of milk from New Zealand all around the world, and thought that was a supply chain. Very impressive it is, and particularly for New Zealand, and that much milk coming out of there. But for me, this is the real supply chain. It's the end-to-end supply chain. It's going from the original source, which happens to be our nice cow, to where we actually consume the product. So it's much more than moving 160,000 containers from port to port around the world. Then we got on our aeroplane. This is a tribute to my adopted country where I learnt about the yogurt and the culture. This is a SKU proliferation. So if we think about the complexity that goes into one final product, we're talking about more than 6 million components in one finished product. And I'm sure with the latest generation of technology, we're probably approaching 7 million components in one finished product. And Boeing procure more than 763 million parts each year. That's pretty complex. So we got off the flight and then we're checking our smartphones. Phenomenal story here. And in fact, when we're discussing, this morning we were discussing something about technology. It was less than 10 years ago. Less than 10 years ago. It was January 19, less than 10 years ago, whatever that was. When Steve Jobs stood up in California, held up the first ever iPhone, and he said, "This will change everything." Less than 10 years ago. We didn't have all that stuff. Anyway, so we have it today, and these guys, they have 730 suppliers across 31 countries. 349 of those suppliers are in China. So we have a global supply network. And then finally, this thing has been around the world 4 times before it got into the retail store, whatever that retail store might be. And here's a map. Minnesota, Taiwan, Japan, China, California. So the DVD player has accumulated several tens of thousands of air miles on its own before it even gets into the retail store. So, the supply chain terminology that we use, we have moved beyond the linear concept of a chain. I was discussing with our Lord Mayor this morning that when one link in the chain around his neck is broken, the chain becomes dysfunctional. When one link in our supply chain breaks, it becomes dysfunctional. But we're much more than a chain. We have this concept of an ecosystem. If this is our company's internal chain is as strong as its weakest link. But here we have now this infinite complexity, and we have profound interdependencies. One of our speakers this morning mentioned catastrophic events around the world, earthquakes, tsunamis, accidents, that can implode your supply chain in ways you weren't necessarily always aware of those vulnerabilities. And the world we live in is much more volatile than it used to be. So by complicating and globalizing our supply chains, we've almost exposed ourselves to more vulnerability in a volatile world. 4 key issues that I explore in my book are these 4. 1, this very complexity and how the supply chain ecosystem is all embracing. Secondly, the need for visibility and how technology will help us have visibility through this complex ecosystem to see what's going on. Thirdly, increasingly environmental concerns, and in fact our question this morning was about carbon footprint. People are thinking about green supply chain. How can we make our supply chain more green? And increasingly consumers are making considered decisions on their buying patterns based on their perception of the environmental footprint of the supply chain of the products they're purchasing in the store. So that raises a question, first of all, how green is our supply chain? Secondly, how do we measure it? And thirdly, how do we report that to the consumers when they've got products side by side in a retail environment? And a fourth key area that I explore is the whole aspect of developing resilient supply chains to mitigate against these risks. And we have catastrophic risks, the issues that make global headlines. So we have accidents, we have acts of sabotage, we have adverse weather conditions, all often with tragic consequences, but they have massive and immediate impact to our supply chain. We then have regular business risk. We talked about outsourcing in one of the slides this morning. We've got supplier failures, we've got currency fluctuations, we've got material supply, component availability, labour shortages, all these sort of regular business risks. So these are key agenda items on the supply chain agenda in the 21st century. As Peter said, the book is here, it's available now. Peter actually has the first copy, and we have a special offer with the publisher, Kogan Page. Laura from Kogan Page is here somewhere, and we have a special 25% discount for the duration of the conference and the conference delegates. So that's the complexity of the global supply chain ecosystems. They're global, we made them global. They're complex, we made them complex. And they're strategic because they're global and complex. And the glue that connects all this complexity together is the very reason we are here. It's the logistics that connects. It enables and empowers these complex global supply chain ecosystems to function. Every business uses logistics. Logistics is all pervasive and it's everywhere, and it's the lifeblood of how we get the milk from the cow to the store, how we get the aeroplane built, how we get the Apple iPhone built, and then how we get the DVD player sorted. It's the glue that blends it all together. And it's on the global stage. The World Economic Forum has a working party on transport and logistics. The key areas, I think, that the logistics service industry plugs together in enabling the ecosystem is first the connectivity, to connect all the different parts of the supply chain together using different various transportation modes, crossing borders, all these sort of components, connecting and plugging them together. We then have this model about insourced and outsourced. We have 3PL, 4PL, LLP, LSP. It's an alphabet soup. I think we deliberately design it to confuse the outside world, as many industries do. So we have different options that are available to explore there. We generally then have, like our industry associations that we're here with today, a sharing of best practices so that we can increase the overall standards of the practices that are being deployed in the industry. Technology, as we heard earlier, connects this supply chain ecosystem together from plugging and playing the different data sources so that we can turn data into information and turn information into supply chain visibility. And then this visibility is a key aspect. And I think the whole complexity of the supply chain ecosystem has made the visibility even more challenging because we have different parties with different systems, frequently quite challenging to connect them all together on a common IT platform. And then finally we have, the collaboration that I mentioned earlier that we need to proceed with caution with. Greg this morning mentioned about when we're looking at business partners, we tend to focus on quality and price, and we don't conduct a third-party risk assessment as the risk we may be exposing ourselves to in the particular partnership. And so one area that continues to concern me about our industry generally, and be aware that for the last 20 years, I've been working in the Asia environment, and certainly out in my part of the world, we do not make enough capitalize on the opportunity from electronic transmission of data and documents. And some of the savings on the right-hand side there, that we could reduce the amount of paperwork and gain more efficiencies in the data entry, the data transmission that would increase the accuracy of the data and provide us with substantial savings in efficiencies. I'd like to see us, particularly, as I say, in my part of the world, doing more in this area of e-logistics. And then, finally, to look at the 4 key components from a logistics perspective that tend to enable the competitiveness and the efficiencies of how logistics empowers the supply chain ecosystem. The first 2 are more relevant to emerging and developing markets, and the third and fourth, I think, apply both in developing and developed markets. First of all, infrastructure. Typically in my part of the world, this is a huge barrier. I'm talking about roads, bridges, ports, tunnels, airports. Typically a barrier to efficient supply chains and efficient logistics networks in the emerging markets in Asia. As is the whole regulatory framework. Generally, this isn't an issue in the developed markets. We're talking here about bureaucracy, business licenses, customs processing, duties processing, all those sort of things. So in my world, those are big issues around China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and all the other places in Asia. The third one, I think, and this is what we're going to talk a lot about in our subsequent presenters and the panel, is the multimodal hinterland connectivity that plugs all these pieces together. So the connection from the road to the rail to the water to the air. And we have experts from each of those fields to join us on the panel. And then the one that we alluded to in our talk this morning is the people. It's still a relatively labor-intensive business, white collar and blue collar. And we discussed on the panel this morning the shortage in developed markets. It seems to be we have shortage of truck drivers, both here and in North America. Again, in my part of the world, the shortage we have labor shortages on the operational level. At Hong Kong Airport, for example, there are 5,000 vacancies at the airport for generally cargo handling and operational workers. We also have in the rapidly developing markets a shortage of blue-collar workers, logisticians, supply chain analysts, supply chain managers, logistics managers, transportation managers, etc. So I think numbers 3 and 4 can apply to both emerging, developing, and also to developed markets. And that's what we're going to be exploring, particularly number 3, the multimodal hinterland connectivity and how that enables the supply chain ecosystem. So that's my setting the scene. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand back to Peter. Peter.